Welcome to the Mullin It Over podcast with Reverend Jack Mullins and Austin Covey. How's it going, everybody? And welcome to another edition of Mullin It Over with
Reverend Jack Mullins
and myself, Austin Covey. And this is our first episode in our new makeshift studio. We're trying something new. We'll see how it
Everything's
works.
makeshift.
That is true. And frequently, it's something new.
That's right. That's right.
We're trying new things regularly around here, and so this is our latest experiment.
So, yeah, it's good to be here. It's been an interesting day. We had a colleague in from one of our denominational foundations today and met with a group about church future and different activities, and it was good to see him. We had been friends or colleagues for 40 years, and I was telling Austin here a day or two ago, I could not remember when I did not know Bobby, and that's why. That was back in 85 when he and I first crossed paths. So, yeah, I can't remember that far back.
For the record, I am not 40 years old, so
No.
They've known each other longer than I've been alive.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it is.
That's impressive.
Yeah, I'm getting to the point where it's impressive to have friends of that tenure that are still living.
Yeah. I mean, kind of morbid, but I guess
Kind
it is
of,
what it is.
kind of dark, but that's okay. Life gets that way sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say, we live there sometimes, so hey,
Don't we?
that's how it goes.
As we were chatting about different things to discuss, one topic that continues to kind of bubble to the surface from time to time is regarding taxation of churches. That seems to be a perennial hot topic, both for individuals from within the church as those from outside the church.
And it seems as time goes, it becomes more and more and more of a hot topic.
It does indeed. Particularly, I think, when you see abuses by the church and abuses of the church.
Would you say, I'm not old enough to know this, and that's not an age joke, it's just really, I don't remember hearing about the, air quotes, mega churches from 30 or 40 years ago. Do you think some of this conversation has arisen as mega churches have become a thing?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it has. I think also that even some of your more quote-unquote traditional big churches, as they have over the years accumulated wealth. I think that's part of the issue. I don't know that people mind churches being able to raise a lot of money to have bigger and better and greater programs, but it's the accumulation of wealth.
Right. And I don't know if it's the program so much. The stuff that I normally see criticized is the sort of elaborate and lavish facilities, or, like when they buy former professional sports arenas or this acquisition of large land, really expensive buildings. That is that wealth aspect that you're talking about, where they're sort of like, building more and more of a capital wealth. So, like a real capital, like a capital investment type setup.
Yeah, and there are supposed to be safeguards in place in regard to monies that are accrued in properties that may be owned by a church but not used by the church.
They have to pay taxes on those.
The Texas state law is written in such a way that it has to be a contiguous piece of property, one continual piece of property, no streets, parking lots, or breaks in it. And the primary purpose of the property as a whole has to be Christian or religious education or worship. That doesn't mean you have to do it with all of it,
Right.
but
Has to be the primary focus.
yeah. And I was a member of a church or minister at a church in Austin a number of years ago that took a case all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. In fact, the attorney that argued the case on behalf of the church was one of the attorneys that had written the new state law about tax exemption for churches.
So he argued his own case, his own law.
He argued against the law that was on the books because he screwed up. He got his conjunctions wrong.
Oh, that's funny.
And which left them open. And in Austin, in downtown Austin, they are scrambling for any tax dollar they can find. And this church owned a parking lot across the street from the main facility.
Okay.
And they leased it out during the week. So they derived income from it. But they were arguing, well, it's a part of the church property and therefore it should be tax exempt. But it was not contiguous. So therefore the primary purpose of that parcel
wasn't church.
Was other than worship or education.
I think I just heard somebody pull on the door.
Should we pause and go check?
Maybe. We'll be right back. And we're back. The mailman was at the door. So
back on the topic of the taxation of churches, and that church got hammered for over $100,000.
It's a lot of taxes.
Was a lot of was for a number of years.
I got you.
And
they did have penalties and interest.
Yeah,
and all.
they were playing catch up.
That's always fun.
And so they started several of the downtown Austin churches who had similar arrangements with the parking company, just closed off their parking lots. So and it was unfortunate because they were being used by lots of students, faculty and staff, and all those parking places just evaporated.
But it wasn't worth the headache to them to.
Not worth the headache. The income they derived didn't offset. But you know, as a younger, what are you, Gen Z or Gen X?
I don't know what any of that stuff is.
Yeah,
I'm 34.
Yeah,
whatever that is.
Whatever that is.
I had to think about it.
What is the read you get from your contemporaries?
I think the read I get from people who are proponents of taxing the churches have a disproportionate view of what most churches look like. I think the air quotes mega churches, I don't know a better thing to call them, get disproportionate visibility to the rest of us. And so I think a lot of people view the mega churches as being what is representative of all churches, or a lot of churches, both from a theological standpoint and from a general operational standpoint. And I would say mega churches. I have no factual evidence to back this up. They may make up 2 to 5% of actual churches.
Yeah.
They're a very small percentage. They're just the most visible.
Right.
And that was another question I had, 'cause we've talked about that before, and you have mentioned that sort of as churches have become more politicized, this has become more of a topic too. Do you remember churches being that politicized? You know, we talked about I don't remember mega churches 30 or 40, obviously I wasn't alive 40 years ago, but I don't remember there being talk of mega churches back then. Were churches as heavily politicized back then, I guess?
I don't think.
I don't know if politicized is the right word, but.
Well, I think it's a good term because I think in the last 10, 15 years we have seen that phenomenon.
It seems, I don't know that there's any correlation, but it seems like those two things have occurred similarly Not that mega churches are inherently politicized, but just the mega churches and the politicization. Words are not my thing. Both have kind of increased on that same trajectory.
Yeah, I think that the politicization, I'll
There you go.
do it that way. May not be right, probably is not, but hey.
Correct us in the comments.
Began probably back in the, I want to say 70s, 80s, with the quote-unquote moral majority.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first of those Christian right political movements, and began to see that bubbling up in congregations. Now, on the flip side, in the African American community, the church has always been a central point for those kind of conversations, but it's a very unique dynamic in which, to my understanding, not coming out of that tradition, I hesitate to speak too strongly, but my understanding is that those churches tended to be a hub for so much social activity, period, just within the communities.
I was actually going to, like, when you mentioned it kind of happening in the 70s and 80s, I had wondered if maybe it started kind of with the Vietnam era. It's sort of more actually back in the 60s. It was really kind of...
Well, of course, see, I was... That was when I was still in high school,
Right.
so I
Wouldn't have been as aware of it.
was not as aware of it, but I think probably you would not be wrong, because there certainly were some progressive movements coming out of the church during those days.
Yeah, the reason I asked is I wondered, like, when we talked about, it's happened more over the last 15 or 20 years, that's sort of the same time frame that we've been involved in our current, the war on terror, air quote, whatever you want to call it. So since 9/11, it seems like that has kind of ramped up, and I wondered if it would have happened during Vietnam also, I guess. It seemed like, just from reading history, there was less polarization around World War II. It seems like once we hit Vietnam, things started to become more polarized, and then maybe I don't know that there was that much polarization at the beginning of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, like immediately following 9/11, but it seems like the farther away we've gotten, the more polarizing that's become.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, I guess what I was wondering is, like, if the tendency in the churches tends to also reasonably follow the tendency in just broader American culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think some of the reactionary knee-jerk to Vietnam was an outgrowth. We had not, as a culture, gotten over the emotionalism of the Korean conflict, and so that was all still pretty fresh in our collective memory. And then to what seemed to jump right back in another jungle war,
right?
With no clear-cut objective, other than beat communism, and that's too vague. I mean,
well, you could say the same thing about war on terror or war on drugs. I mean, as general rules, those are pretty vague and some would argue unachievable. Criteria.
When I think about taxing churches, and I can look, and you mentioned the mega churches, and then I look at small churches. Is there a way to equitably provide a taxation structure which makes churches accountable for the accumulation of wealth?
I think that is a hard, because I think, like when we look at our situation, I think if we had to pay taxes, I mean, we're already in a pickle. No, not to be too crass, but I think if we had to pay taxes, we'd be kind of done.
Well, but you look at, okay, here's a model to consider.
Hmm.
Whatever your budget, say you have an annual budget of $500,000. What that means is that you've got to accumulate resources up to that budget.
Right.
I mean, it's one thing to be nonprofit, but it's another thing to you've got to have enough,
Right.
and you need some carryover.
Right.
And if you had the tax forms to fill out, show you raised enough to cover your budget, plus an additional 10% each year for
I was gonna say
carryover.
20%, but fair enough.
Okay.
10%'s fine.
You don't pay tax on that. You're still within that
Right.
tax exempt phase. You don't start paying tax until you exceed what is necessary.
Yeah, I think ultimately that's not. I don't think that does anything. I think you're going to end up in the same thing with businesses that are taxed, where you're able to roll money into capital expense accounts or invest into depreciating capital assets and things like that to reduce your tax burden. And that's how you see these really high cash flow businesses that don't pay any taxes, because they reinvest their money into the business, which is all capital investment. I'm not a tax attorney, so I'm probably botching some of this. But effectively, if you're investing heavily in capital investment, you're not paying taxes on that money. And so that's how you see these really mega corporations that cash flow a lot of money, but they're constantly reinvesting it, and then they don't end up having to pay a lot
You
of
don't
taxes.
have any provisions for reinvestment. If
Yeah,
you
you do.
accumulate, no, I'm talking.
Right,
The
but
model I'm looking at,
I'm saying churches are just going to do the same thing.
not if they can't.
How could they not? They can
The
just go
law
buy
doesn't
another.
allow it.
The law can't prohibit them from building a bigger
Law
building.
can do anything that it wants to.
That's a really slippery slope to you need a new country.
Well,
If
no,
the
but
law
what
is
I'm saying
prohibiting
is if-
churches from building a bigger building, that's a problem.
Again, as long as it is a contiguous piece of property, and looking at within the state of Texas, then it's a contiguous piece of property for which the primary purpose is.
It wouldn't have to be contiguous. That's what I'm saying. Say we wanted to go open a new branch north of here.
Okay,
We can't do that. The law
We can
prohibits
do
us
that.
from doing that.
you can do that.
You just said the law
But
would
you
prohibit
can't
that
buy
from
an
happening.
office building downtown Dallas and hide your assets there.
Right, but that's different. Because I said if you wanted to expand the church, and you
Okay,
said the law would prohibit you from doing that.
Well, okay, when you started, it wasn't so much. Yeah, I guess you
That
did
is,
say
I'm
expand
saying, right.
program.
You could continuously expand your programming, because if the
Well,
rule is
then you're continually, if you're continually expanding your program, then you're continually expanding your need for the increased offerings. You're still not running an accumulation.
right, but that's my point. Is I don't think most of those churches are just sitting on money in the bank. That's why they have mega facilities, because they've ramped up their budget. So if I buy a 20,000 seat building, that's all within that budget. That's not taxed.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does.
So I can continuously grow and grow and grow and grow, as long as it's a justifiable budget. It doesn't matter how big I get; it's still not taxed.
Okay.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
That's
I guess
what the
what
churches will
I'm
start
doing
doing.
is, and I see what you're saying there, and I have no problem, obviously, at all with churches that have excess funds, say at the end of a 3-year cycle, and use those funds to enlarge and expand their ministry and programs. I think they should. I think my issue and issue of others is when you have downtown, and I don't want to call out the church by name,
There are a few that I can think of, but yeah.
in downtown Dallas who own multiple investment in or entire office buildings that they are able to run tax exempt because it is part of the church property.
Gotcha. Because the ones that come to my mind are the ones with these like mega facilities, in the sense that they have, like a former sports arena as their sanctuary.
Yeah.
Okay, well, technically that's part of the church, but I think, like, to me, you can't. you can certainly attempt, but it's very difficult to legislate morality, and it's very difficult to legislate. Like, I think you have to get to the root of like, are in accumulating facilities, are we really fulfilling the mission that we're called to do? Because the more facilities we accumulate, the more money it requires to maintain those facilities. Is that really what we're called to be doing or not? And I don't think this is a legislatable solution. Does that make sense?
It does. And again, that gets back to one's a theology of church, because there are those folks who will say, the mission of the church is to feed the hungry, house the homeless, clothe the naked. There are others who will say that's all well and good, but in our view, the mission of the church is to bring souls to God through Jesus Christ.
Right.
And so our expansion of those program arenas, that's their focus.
Right.
Rather than the other. And that you talk slippery slope.
Right.
That's an extremely slippery theological slope.
Yes. Well, I was going to say that's a theological debate, not a legal one, though.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, because I understand what you're saying from a budget perspective, but you can just continuously grow your facilities and stay within that sort of like budget rule. Yeah, I don't think it's good for churches to just accumulate money and sit on it, but I don't think most of them do. I think they reinvest in building facilities and nicer equipment, and I think churches spend a lot of money.
Some of them do.
We don't, because we don't have it. But
well, we don't, and we are living off of old money, meaning prior investments.
Right.
So we have no income to be taxed.
Right.
It's all after tax, if you will.
I think if you wanted to make the argument, income not acquired by donorship.
Okay.
If you have income not acquired by donorship, that should be eligible to be taxed. Then you do get into the whole like, well, we don't actually rent the building; we allow them to use it for an annual donation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's variation on the wording, but it's accomplishing the same goal.
Except that some churches are set up in such a way someone could come in and drop $100,000 in 1 year, and they can spread that gift out over multiple, and the church still gets that influx of cash that they can then turn around and invest. One of our churches downtown Dallas has about used to be as much as $1.25 million in endowments and investments, and they were sitting on it, drawing the the proceeds off of it, but they still were sitting on a great deal of wealth.
I know other churches that do that, and I've had I would say a little bit of a disagreement with some of the people that I know that go to those churches who don't believe they should be doing that. They don't think they should be sitting on that money. And I understand that argument. From the business side, that endowment money is probably the only reason they're still open, though. I mean, in a certain extent, that's where we're at. We didn't have an endowment, but we had a property sale that effectively was the same thing, and that's the only reason we're still here.
Right.
And I think in an era where people are donating less and less, you can extrapolate the reasons for that. I've got a few thoughts on that, but that's neither here nor there. I think in some instances, the only churches that survive may end up being the ones that have endowments.
Could be.
Because there's I don't know of too many places anymore, at least that I'm familiar with in our denomination, that are actually, to use a business term, cash flow positive, where the money that's being donated actually meets or exceeds the budget.
Right.
They're relying on endowment money, or memorial funds, to kind of keep the thing going.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think you've made this argument, I think, rightly, that the churches that start to step outside of the church arena should kind of open themselves. You know what I'm talking about when they start to engage in um, political posturing or whatever you want to say.
Yeah, and I've because of some activity in some support groups, become more and more aware of individuals who have felt pushed out of their home churches because the church hierarchy and the clergy have let them know, if you're not of a particular persuasion, then you need to get right with Jesus.
Yeah.
And,
or find someplace else to be.
Or find someplace else to be. And, whether you're on the progressive side of that or the fundamentalist side of that, I don't think that's right. I think, especially when you start identifying politicians by name from the pulpit.
Yeah, that's scary.
To me, that's okay. You just pulled your own plug on your 501c.
Yeah.
You should not have that, or that minister should be reprimanded.
I agree.
There have been times I have been accused of preaching politics, but I've always tried to be very careful to make sure that anything I say can be, quote unquote, fact checked against the gospel.
Right. Well, I think, like you said, once you start specifically mentioning names, it's like, you've crossed the threshold there. That there's something about separation of church and state.
I had a good friend in Denton who approached me for could I host a meeting of, say, young Democrat women. I said, I would love to say yes, but I'm going to say no, I won't back you on that. And she said, well, why? I said, okay, if we let you and let that group, and I believe in the group you're supporting and promoting. I wish we could. But then we turned around and we were approached by a local chapter of the John Birch Society.
I don't even know what that is, but okay.
Ultra right wing.
Gotcha.
I mean, so far right, they fell off the map. Old group and the older folks, but if we let your political group come in, we are bound to allow the other. Now, do you want that? And she said, no. I'd rather go find a neutral place. I said, I think that's wise because I need to keep this open philosophically, theologically, for folks from both sides without showing, favoritism or disdain for either group.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be hard to do.
Well, I think in a world that seems, or I won't say a greater world, in a American culture that seems to be progressing to more and more division a lot of times, having those neutral ground places where we actually work on bringing people together, and having that togetherness aspect, that worshipfulness aspect, I think we need to not make everything a divisive. You know what I mean? Like, let's not make it all a battleground, so to speak.
Now, I will confess that there are times when I will listen to the news, read the news, hear an interview that just freaking drives me nuts and makes me so angry. I want to express and vent that anger, but then I have to try to get a handle on it. And if I'm going to vent, I need to not vent about the person.
Right.
I need to be sure that I address the issue and do so from a biblical context and framework.
And at that point,
And that makes it a whole lot more work.
It does, but probably makes it have a lot more impact too, I would think.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think I don't think arguments where you end up shouting over an individual are that impactful. I think once
Yeah.
you start to tailor those arguments in the framework of not just I am angry, but why am I
Yeah.
why am I angry, or why
Yeah.
does this not chart with what I consider to be biblically accurate? You know what I mean? Like, I think that it lands
Yeah.
with people a little better. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I had one time, and a member of the church just really got upset with it, and I couldn't understand. And her first reaction was, "You're preaching politics," and
Mhm.
I said, "How did I preach politics? Tell me one thing I said that was political."
Mm-hmm.
And because I stated that when we have a situation in which a person has been placed in a position where they were physically and sexually vulnerable and violated,
Mm-hmm.
that we need to first care for that person in that situation. When we have someone who has said, that person sexually assaulted me, physically assaulted
Mm-hmm.
me, we need to listen to that person and find out what's going on.
When
If
you
it's
say
not
that person, you mean the accuser or the accused?
the victim,
Okay.
and turns to find out the individual who had gotten so upset what was triggered over the issue because that had been her experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where not trying to shout over somebody,
Mm-hmm.
but trying to slow down and listen,
Right.
you can sometimes find out what it is that is triggering.
Yes. When tracking back to the church thing, the church is being taxed thing a little bit, I think some of the stuff that I see that kind of makes me balk is, like we've talked about, the mega facilities, but also when you see churches with private jets, when you see these kinds of things. I don't know. Again, I don't know that you legislate. I think it would be very hard to legislate what is or isn't a valid ministry expense. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
do you really need a private jet? Is that a valid ministry expense? Do you really need, when you see some of these churches put on very good productions for video, when they do their video services or whatever, but you also know the quality of camera they're using for that. And it's like, are $50,000 cameras or $30,000 cameras really?
Yeah.
Is that because the system that we set up before, we used $200 camera, $225 cameras or whatever, and it worked fine.
Yeah.
It's like, I think. I think ultimately that has to be a theology question, not a legal question. But I do think that's the kind of stuff in the people that I know who sort of balk at church resources. That's the kind of stuff that they balk at.
I agree.
Oh, Pastor so and so has a private jet. Pastor so and so has a 10,000 square foot house.
Has his
Not that-
own helipad. And,
Yeah, exactly. And what that person lives in is that person's business. They may acquire that wealth from other means. I've heard of some megachurch pastors who supposedly don't even take a salary. They write books or do these other things, and all their money that they spend personally is made off of these.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's true or not. They can say whatever they want. You know what I mean? But
Billy Graham, for a large number of years, claimed to have quit taking a salary from the Billy Graham Crusades and was living solely off of royalties from his books and stuff. I don't know. I never heard him say that in an interview. That's secondhand information. From what I know of the man, it sounds consistent.
right.
And in that regard, but if as a minister you are independently financially secure,
Right.
and you can allow the church to then, whatever your salary might have been, funnel that back into the ministry of the church. There's a lot of churches that could really benefit
Right.
from that.
When I do think, rightly or wrongly, that's up to user or listener perception, I suppose. In church work, whether you be clergy or support staff, whatever, I do think you, to a certain extent, need to be mindful. You know, it's like, even if you are independently wealthy, maybe you should be mindful of the optics of a minister with a 10,000 square foot house, a helipad, and private jet. You know what I mean? Just like that, you know, if you pull up to church in your Lamborghini or whatever,
Yeah,
like,
that's
even if
not
you,
a good optic.
right, it's like, you know, in your defense, you may say, well, I do a speaking tour and I sell books and I do these other things. I didn't make this money from the church. But the optic isn't, in my opinion, super great.
Yeah. Because somebody out there is going to look at that and say, that church has their priorities wrong because their minister is able to drive around in a Lambo.
Right. Well, and I think, you know, you could make, like we were saying earlier when you said, you know, growing the facilities is bringing more souls to God or whatever you want to say, and they could argue that as a ministry growth or whatever. I think you could also say, yeah, but spending all of that money maintaining that facility is, you know, maybe having your priorities out of order too.
Well, and also churches who they'll gather in worship for 2 hours a week,
mm-hmm.
but there's going to be 20 hours of the week that they're renting the facility out as a wedding chapel.
Right.
Those funds are, quote unquote, untaxable
mm-hmm.
because, as you alluded to earlier, it's how you present it,
right.
And this is an in-kind contribution to offset the expense of the facility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, you're renting the church for a wedding.
Well, some would argue, though, that a wedding is a spiritual endeavor. That's a pursuit of the church.
Yeah.
I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying I've heard that argument made.
You're exactly right.
I don't know if I am or not.
Well, no, you are, because that is certainly one of the sacraments of the church. That being said, when I see a chapel being rented out and there's no connection with the couple,
mm-hmm.
you come in for an hour. One day we'll go over the service
mm-hmm.
and get the logistics down. You give us your check. I'll see you at the service
mm-hmm.
for 35, 45 minutes. And then you're gone. I never see you again. There's no relationship.
Right.
I have had someone, it's been a minute, who came to me and said, can you do it without religious language?
Mm-hmm.
I go, excuse me? Can you do it without referring to God or Jesus? No, I can't. Or I guess I could, but I won't.
Right.
Because you're coming to me as a minister.
Mm-hmm.
You're coming into this place. It is a church. It is a house of God. If you want a secular wedding, go find a secular chapel.
Right.
And then do it that way.
I do know a minister that did a secular wedding. They didn't do it in the church, but I did kind of wonder how that worked, because you are licensed or government approved, whatever you want to say, to perform this based on your ministry status.
Yeah.
But you're performing a secular wedding not as a. Does that make sense?
Yes,
it's like
absolutely.
Your ministry is what gives you the capability of doing this, yet you're not doing it in a ministerial capacity. How does that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm just like, how does that work? That's interesting.
There are a number of venues scattered through North Texas,
mm-hmm.
up there around Denton,
right.
who retreat centers and are used
mm-hmm.
for lots of weddings. And I did go out there to do one time, and I had met with the couple, and they made the request to not make it overly religious.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talked, I said, okay, here's my compromise. I'm going to open with prayer. I'm going to close with prayer.
Mm-hmm.
The middle stuff can pretty easy keep it pretty secular.
Right.
But since it was a secular environment
mm-hmm.
and a just basically a wedding venue, I wasn't struggling with not desecration of the sanctity of the church, but it wasn't the issue.
All right. That makes
I
sense.
did have almost more of an issue when I had to perform a wedding with a young lady who was. She claimed she was Orthodox Jewish, and he was the son of a disciple of Christ minister whom I knew.
Okay.
And how to keep it religious but not Christian.
That's an interesting pairing.
Yeah, and the marriage lasted about. They got off the property, let's say that.
Oh, that's not good.
No, but
I do know somebody, though. He's not Orthodox Jewish, but he's Jewish, and his wife is Methodist, and they've been married for like 40 years.
I know it. I think it depends on the individuals and how they approach the relationship and how they approach their own expressions of faith.
That makes sense.
And she was much less flexible than he was.
So she leaned into the Orthodox Jewish
For the wedding.
Ah, okay. Less so afterwards.
Yeah.
Not good.
She was quite upset at the flavor of the wine because, there was a point within the Jewish context of the service where the couple drinks a glass of wine to consecrate the service.
Okay, I did not know that. I'm learning
And
something.
so I had talked with the groom, and he said, "Man, this is a problem." I said, "Just show up with it. We're not going to pass it around. There's no one going to taste it but you."
Why was it a problem to him?
Well, because he knew the church had a policy, no alcohol on the property.
Ah, okay, yeah.
He was raised DOC.
Yeah, that
he
makes
knew
sense. Knew the way that...
knew the way it ran.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
Then right before the service, he came to me and said, "I have a real odd request. I mean, we're 10 minutes out.
Oh.
Do you have a corkscrew?"
Oh, jeez.
No.
No. No, we don't.
Do you have any communion wine in the fridge? Yep, help yourself. And after the service,
So is it grape juice?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
overheard her say, "Where did you get that wine? That was horrible." He said, "Well, it was communion wine."
So it was grape juice.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Nice.
He knew he could find
Yeah.
some grape juice.
Fine communion wine.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, good old Welch's.
Yeah. What was the backstory you were telling me to Welch's?
During Prohibition, of course, one of the negative impacts of Prohibition was on the celebration of communion. And at that time, everybody still used communion wine.
Right.
And the problem with grape juice was it would not store. They did not have a way to pasteurize it. So it would ferment
It would just do it on its own.
on its own. And there was a Methodist layperson who was in the food service industry who came up with a pasteurization process for grape juice. His name was Welch.
And that's how we got Welch's.
And that's how we got Welch's grape juice.
There you
That's why you saw Welch's grape juice in 1 million churches around the country.
He did a good job of marketing it, huh?
He did, because all of the Methodists started using it. And of course, they finally lifted the prohibition against use in a religious context. But by then, so many churches realized, this is cheaper. It covers the theological points close enough for us, and it tastes better.
Yeah. And less potential downside.
Yeah.
Less potential problems.
Yeah. So, now, I wish I could say, in regard to the church taxation issue, that there were easy remedies to the issues, because for a lot of folks outside the church, they use that as an issue to remain outside the church. And that's a personal thing. I don't think that the abuses are as great as they portray them. I think you're exactly right that the large mega churches have called a lot of undue attention.
Yeah, I think in a lot of contexts, not just this one, and I don't mean to demonize them, but I do think they have cast a shadow over the rest of us in a lot of frameworks.
Yeah, and I think, and you alluded to it, the televangelists, the ones who get on TV or back in the day on the radio, and
put your hand on the TV.
Put your hand on the TV, and that power you feel is the power of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, no, it's not a static electricity, dude.
Yeah, I think certainly when you start to see the grifters, I think it's a legitimate argument about taxing them.
And it's hard to tell the grifters from those who are sincere and simply effective
communicators.
Robert Schuller in California.
Was he the Crystal Cathedral guy?
Crystal Cathedral. And, he started out in drive-in movie theaters.
Interesting.
And over the years built up the Crystal Cathedral. And one thing a lot of people never realized was that congregation was a member of the United Church of Christ. His ordination was through the UCC. He was approached after the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker fiasco back in the, I think it was 80s. Big televangelist, had a theme park, had everything, and then fell from grace, so to speak. And a lot of the TV evangelists came together. They were going to start their own oversight group. And they invited him to be a part of the conversation. They had that broadcast on TV. He said, okay, here are my conditions. You renounce your anti-Semitism. You renounce all of your feminine stances.
Right.
You open your books to outside review and accountability. And no, we can't do that. He said, then I have no use for you.
Right.
I'm a pastor in a church that is locally governed. I'm accountable to an established denomination through which I hold my credentials. Yeah, I've been effective, but I've done it. I've kept my nose clean.
The right way.
I've done it the right way.
The right way, yeah.
You have nothing that will benefit me. And I obviously remember that to this day, and thought, he's sometimes lumped in with those folks because his show was polished, it was well done, it was well edited. He was a tremendous orator, but he did it the right way.
Yeah. And I was reading this article the other day. I'd have to go back and find it. It was not church related. It was talking about people in general. And I don't remember any of their data, but they were making the argument that accumulation of wealth or resources starts to change people significantly in how they behave. And I guess have the concern or wonder in churches that accumulate these massive facilities and things, if it doesn't, whether intentionally or not, maybe they're not intentionally trying to be prophet gospel or whatever. I wonder if at some point they do start to depart from really the purpose that we're called to, just as a byproduct of the accumulation of their wealth and resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're exactly on target. And you don't have to get to the prosperity gospel churches, the mega churches. You can see it in highly affluent mainline congregations. One of ours downtown, at one point, largest congregation in the denomination in the U.S. And I was on staff there for a time, and one of the older members said, I was talking about doing something. Well, that's just not our way of doing things. And I turned to her, I said, you've been in decline since 1968. How well is your way of doing things working out for you? But they had this sense of entitlement. I think you see a lot of these churches.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, we're entitled to what you have. We're entitled to these special considerations because look how successful we are.
Well, I think there starts to become a shift in mentality of, you know, we have now developed this tremendous budget and these tremendous facilities. We can't maybe say what we need to say because we can't run anybody off, because if we run anybody off, we can't. You become really more married to the facility than you do to preaching.
Yeah.
You know, like when you've talked about preaching the gospel and people saying, oh, you're preaching politics or you're doing this or that or whatever. I think if you become more married to this idea of I have to maintain this facility, I have to maintain this staff, et cetera, I wonder that you start to lose the edge that you really need to be effective.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. The congregation of which I'm thinking, years and years ago, they had built a new wing to the church, and they built it as a multi-purpose gymnasium and great room. It had a big stage and had a basketball court. And over time, as the congregation aged and they lost the kids and lost their focus, and that neighborhood changed, they carpeted it, hung chandeliers, and that became a great room, a banquet hall, and that was all they used it for. And just in the course of the last few years, they have undergone a process. They have pulled up the carpet. They have exposed the hardwood, the basketball courts. They are taking it back to what it was originally intended. They can still have lunches and meals in there. And they've hired a minister of recreational, director of recreational ministries. And so they have, what am I thinking of? Not tennis, but pickleball.
Yes.
They have pickleball leagues. They have volleyball, and they're doing those things to attract people. And like our friend with a Hispanic congregation said, just let me open with a prayer and let me close with a prayer, whatever your activity is.
Yeah.
And give me 5 minutes out of your 3-hour time span. And, you know, there's something to be said for that.
I agree.
But they got away from it. They got more focused on catering to the Lakewood Country Club set, Dallas Country Club set.
When I think what you said, I think about it, the entitlement aspect is interesting too. I think some people almost, and you've had more experience with this than me, but I think you see this sometimes. They almost become entitled to success. We've had success before. Boy, this is going to be a stretch. In political science, sometimes they refer to this, or at least when I got my degree in political science, they referred to the United States' propensity to do this as American exceptionalism. We believed we would be successful because we're the United States, and we always have been. Therefore, obviously, we will be. Not, we are infallible.
Yeah.
And like we've seen that in other conversations with people that at churches that are maybe reaching the end of their life, and they're saying, "Man, I never thought we would be here."
Yeah.
And my thought is kind of the fact that you didn't think you would be here is probably why you are.
Yeah.
You started to take it for granted. You started to have a sense of exceptionalism that you were infallible. Not that they thought they were perfect. They just didn't think the organization could fail.
Yeah.
And they got complacent and comfortable, and then.
Yeah.
But
none of us think we're going to die.
Yeah, that's true.
And churches as if you look at a church as a living organism, it suffers from that same syndrome. And I think you're right. We get accustomed to success, and we quit working for it.
Right.
Whatever your success translates to. So you quit working and dreaming and being progressive and proactive. You just expect it to come.
Right. That's something I've always appreciated about working with you, is that you don't claim to know everything. You don't claim to always have the answer, but you're always open to trying something.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm not saying he doesn't have the answers. He's got a lot of answers, but there, nobody has all the answers,
but they're not always right.
Well, but some people, they either think they know everything and they don't, or they think if they don't know it, it won't work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If it's not my idea, it's not a good idea, and I've never experienced that with you. And we're able to always push the boundaries and kind of try new things and try different things, and that's not that's a rarity if you work with clergy. Most of them, at least most of the ones that I've had the pleasure of working with or displeasure of working with, no offense to them, they do become very rigid, and they do sort of develop this. Entitlement may be overly harsh, but just this, it worked once. Obviously, it's going to work again. Right. Kind of ideology
And if it's my idea, it's got to be the right idea.
Right.
And I've worked with clergy like that. But the ones with whom I feel I have been most successful working with and enjoy working with are those who think outside the box, and if they see a box, they look for an exit.
Right. Yeah, I heard a guy say one time in an interview, he said, you hear people talk about thinking in the box or out of the box. He said, if you think there even is a box, you're already behind.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting, I don't know that the guy said anything else that was worth a flip in the whole interview, but that particular part kind of stuck with me. I was like, that's an interesting, I think, truthfulness to it.
I agree.
But I do think, when we were talking about those churches that accumulate lots of wealth, whether it be money in the bank or facility wealth, if you will, programming wealth, I think sometimes the bigger that building is, the smaller the box is, so to speak.
Yeah.
You don't give yourself the latitude because now you're married to these bills. Because we've seen a lot of churches have to liquidate a facility and downsize because
they can't afford the upkeep.
Yep.
And when they start hitting about 35 years of age and that equipment starts wearing out and breaking down, and replacement and repair becomes more and more costly.
Right. Yeah, and that tends to be, if you don't do a lot of upkeep on a regular basis, that tends to be a bill that kind of hits all at once.
Yeah.
Like you said, it hits that certain time frame where everything kind of goes out at the same time. And yeah.
Kind of like, if you're driving a car with 100,000 miles, it's going to break down.
Yeah.
There's no if. It's just a matter of when. And when you're running a HVAC system that's 35 years old, you might as well put the money in the bank and put a lot of it. Cause
it's going to be expensive and it's going to break.
And unfortunately, a lot of people remember, well, when we bought it, it was only $12,000. Yeah, that was 35 years ago, dude.
Yeah, you could buy a house for $50,000 then too. You can't do that anymore.
and sometimes those long memories work against you.
Yes, you've said that before. Like, well, back when we started this or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's been a minute.
Yeah, like my friend that came by today. We kind of reminisced about some of those early things we were involved with working together, and we were on a camp board together down in the hill country, and we were instrumental in that area, selling that facility, and that nearly created a uprising. I mean, nothing holds people's attention better than a church camp
Yeah.
through which they found God, maybe their first love,
Mm-hmm.
and all those memories, and then to turn around and sell it and invest in a different piece of property in a different area.
Right.
And here, 35 years later, the camp they go to now has that hold on their
Right.
hearts, but it was a hard sell.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we sold it, it was down on one of those rivers down there, and came some heavy rains and flash floods, and we nearly lost a couple of kids.
Oh, wow.
And that's when we said, we've got to get rid of this property. It's too dangerous. So, well,
That makes sense.
I know you can talk forever. I am about talked out, and I've got another couple hours ahead of me.
Yeah, you've got to go do a Bible study.
I've got to go do a Bible study or a debriefing, one or the other, not sure which. But
Yeah, I like how he threw me under the bus there, right?
yeah, that's why you're here. But thank you for setting it up for me, and thank all of you for whatever time you can invest in us, and whatever level of patience you have to listen to our ramblings.
I ramble. Your stuff is intelligent and makes sense.
That's just ramble with focus.
There you go.
So, God bless you all. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Mulling It Over. I hope that you found something meaningful and beneficial to take with you.
If you have any questions or topics you would like to hear us discuss, you can either put them down in the video comments, or you can email them to us at office@irvingnorthcc.org.
As always, we want to invite you to join us for worship every Sunday morning, 11 o'clock a.m. at Irving North Christian Church, 2602 Texas Drive, Irving, Texas. May God bless.